At the far end of Maplewood Drive in a small Ohio suburb stood a modest, aging house with pale blue siding and a narrow front porch. The yard was simple but carefully maintained. A row of rose bushes lined the walkway, and a wooden wind chime hung beside the front door, softly clinking whenever the wind moved through the neighborhood. Inside that quiet house lived Margaret Cole and her son, Ethan Cole. To the outside world, they looked like an ordinary family. Margaret was 72 years old, a widow who had spent most of her life working as a school cafeteria cook. After her husband died decades earlier in an industrial accident, she raised Ethan alone. Friends and neighbors often described her as patient, kind, and deeply devoted to her only child. Ethan, now 36, had rarely lived anywhere else. He worked at a small auto repair shop just 10 minutes away from the house. His days were predictable: long hours under car hoods, the smell of oil on his hands, the steady rhythm of tools striking metal. He wasn't a man who talked much. Most people who knew him simply described him as quiet. Every evening around 6, Ethan's truck rolled into the gravel driveway beside the house. Margaret was usually already in the kitchen by then, preparing dinner. Cooking had always been her way of caring for people. Even after Ethan became an adult, she never stopped. "Wash your hands before you sit down," she would say from the stove. Ethan would nod silently and head toward the sink. Their conversations were often short, but they had a routine that had lasted for years. Margaret would ask about work. Ethan would answer with a few brief sentences. After dinner, Margaret washed the dishes while Ethan watched the evening news in the living room. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was stable. Still, beneath that quiet routine, something more complicated existed between them. Margaret's devotion sometimes felt overwhelming to Ethan. She worried about his diet, his sleep, even the hours he worked. To her, Ethan was still the boy she had protected for so many years. To Ethan, however, the house often felt smaller than it should. The walls carried decades of shared memories, some warm, some heavy. Living together for so long had created a bond that was both comforting and suffocating at the same time. Neighbors rarely saw conflict between them. From the outside, the Cole home appeared calm, even peaceful. But life inside the house was more fragile than it seemed. In places where routines never change, even the smallest disturbance can feel enormous. And one evening, something subtle entered the house, something that would quietly begin to unravel the fragile balance between a mother and her son. The following week began like any other. On Monday evening, Ethan Cole pulled his pickup truck into the gravel driveway just after sunset. The sky above the quiet Ohio neighborhood was fading from pale orange to deep blue. Inside the house, the warm glow of the kitchen light spilled through the window, exactly as it did every night. Margaret Cole was already preparing dinner. Ethan stepped inside, placing his keys on the small wooden table near the door. The house smelled faintly of roasted chicken and onions from the kitchen. "Long day?" Margaret called out from the stove. "The usual," Ethan replied, shrugging off his work jacket. He washed the grease from his hands at the sink and sat down at the kitchen table. Margaret moved around the small space with the quiet efficiency she had developed over decades of cooking. She placed a plate in front of him, then set down a glass of water. As she leaned closer to the table, Ethan noticed something. A faint odor. It wasn't strong. It wasn't even easy to identify. But it was unusual enough to make him pause. At first, he assumed it came from the kitchen. Maybe something had spoiled in the refrigerator. Maybe the trash needed to be taken out. He continued eating, trying to ignore it. But when Margaret walked past him again, the smell returned. This time it lingered slightly longer. Ethan frowned. Margaret didn't seem to notice anything unusual. She sat across from him and began eating quietly, the way she always did. For a moment, Ethan considered saying something. Then he changed his mind. It felt awkward to mention it. Dinner finished in the same quiet routine it always followed. Margaret gathered the plates and carried them to the sink. Ethan stood up to leave the kitchen, but as he passed beside her, the odor reached him again. Stronger now. He stopped in the doorway. "Mom," he said slowly, "do you smell something?" Margaret turned around, puzzled. "Smell what?" "I don't know, something strange." She glanced around the kitchen, then shrugged lightly. "This house has smelled like old pipes since the 90s, she said with a small laugh. "You probably just noticed it today." Her answer sounded casual, almost amused. Ethan nodded, but something about the moment unsettled him. Because the smell hadn't come from the house. It had come from her. Over the next few days, Ethan tried to convince himself that the moment in the kitchen had meant nothing. Houses developed strange smells all the time. Old plumbing, damp wood, leftover food, any of those could explain it. Maplewood Drive was full of homes built in the 1970s, and many of them carried the same faint scent of age. But the more Ethan paid attention, the harder it became to dismiss what he had noticed. On Tuesday evening, the smell returned. Margaret was standing near the stove again, stirring a pot of soup while soft music played from the small radio on the counter. Ethan stepped into the kitchen after work and immediately felt that same uncomfortable sensation in his chest. The odor was faint, but unmistakable. He sat down slowly at the table, watching his mother move around the room. Margaret seemed perfectly normal. Her gray hair was neatly pinned back, and she wore the same soft blue sweater she often wore around the house. She hummed quietly while reaching for bowls in the cabinet. Yet when she passed behind Ethan's chair, the smell followed her again. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. This time he said nothing. He simply finished his meal faster than usual and carried his plate to the sink. Margaret noticed. "You're eating quick tonight," she said gently. "Just tired," Ethan replied. She studied him for a moment but didn't press further. Later that night, Ethan was watching television when Margaret walked through the living room on her way to the hallway. As she passed the couch, the odor drifted into the air again, stronger now, heavier. Ethan sat upright. Something wasn't right. By Wednesday, the smell had become impossible to ignore. It appeared whenever Margaret came close. Not always strong, but always present. Ethan began opening the windows in the house, even when the evening air grew colder. Margaret noticed that too. "Why are all the windows open?" she asked one afternoon. "Just need some fresh air," Ethan said. She looked at him carefully. "Is this about the smell you mentioned?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "Yeah, it is." Margaret sighed softly, as if embarrassed. "It's probably just the medication the doctor gave me last week," she said. "Sometimes those things affect your skin." Ethan frowned. "What kind of medication?" "Just something for a rash," she replied quickly. Her explanation sounded simple enough. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was wrong. Because the odor didn't resemble medicine. It carried a heavier scent, something sour, something unsettling. And once that thought entered Ethan's mind, it refused to leave. By the end of the week, the smell had stopped being a small curiosity for Ethan Cole. It had become something he could not ignore. At work, while tightening bolts beneath a pickup truck, the memory of it drifted into his mind again. It was strange how a scent could linger long after it was gone. Even surrounded by motor oil and metal, Ethan felt as if the odor from the house followed him. He tried to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept returning to the same question. What was really causing it? That evening when he came home, Margaret was sitting in the living room reading a paperback novel. The soft lamp beside her cast warm light across the quiet room. "Hey, honey," she said with a gentle smile. Ethan nodded and hung his jacket by the door. For a moment, everything looked perfectly normal. Then Margaret stood up. As she walked past him toward the kitchen, the smell surfaced again. Stronger. Ethan instinctively stepped back. Margaret noticed immediately. Her smile faded. "Ethan, why did you move away from me like that?" He hesitated before answering. "That smell again." Margaret looked embarrassed, almost ashamed. "I told you, it's probably the medication." Ethan studied her carefully. "Then maybe you should go back to the doctor." "It's not that serious," she replied. But it doesn't smell normal, Ethan insisted. Margaret's voice grew firmer. Ethan, please drop it. But Ethan couldn't drop it anymore. Over the next few days, he began watching his mother more closely than ever before. Small details that once seemed ordinary now felt suspicious. Margaret had started wearing long sleeves around the house, even when the heat was on. She spent longer periods in the bathroom with the door locked. Sometimes he noticed her quietly adjusting the collar of her shirt as if trying to hide something near her neck. Each small observation fed Ethan's growing unease. One afternoon he returned home earlier than usual. Margaret was standing in the hallway when he entered. She looked surprised to see him. "You're home early," she said. "Shop closed early today," Ethan replied. As she stepped closer, the odor hit him immediately, sharp, unpleasant, impossible to ignore. Ethan felt a wave of frustration rise inside him. "Mom," he said slowly, "you need to tell me what's going on." Margaret's eyes filled with discomfort. "There's nothing going on." But Ethan no longer believed that. Because by now, the smell was no longer just a smell. In Ethan's mind, it had become a sign. A warning that something inside the house, and inside his mother, was deeply wrong. By the following week, the atmosphere inside the Cole house had changed in ways neither Ethan nor Margaret could ignore. The routines remained the same on the surface. Margaret still cooked dinner each evening. Ethan still returned home from the repair shop around 6. The same news programs played on the television, and the same wind chime outside the porch door continued its quiet clatter in the evening breeze. But something inside the house had shifted. Conversations became shorter. Silence lingered longer. Ethan found himself watching his mother constantly. Every movement she made seemed to confirm his growing suspicion that something was wrong. When she walked through the room, he noticed the way she kept a slight distance from him. When she spoke, her tone carried a cautious softness, as if she were trying to avoid upsetting him. Margaret, in turn, could feel the change in her son. One evening during dinner, she set a plate in front of him and paused. "Ethan," she said gently, "you've been acting different lately." He didn't look up from his food. "How so?" "You keep staring at me." Ethan finally raised his eyes. "Because something's not right." Margaret sighed, clearly exhausted by the conversation that had repeated itself several times over the past few days. "It's the same thing again, isn't it?" she asked quietly. "The smell," Ethan said. Margaret placed both hands on the edge of the table, as though steadying herself. "I told you already," she said. "The doctor said it's an infection on my skin. It happens sometimes when people get older." Ethan frowned. "What kind of infection?" "Just irritation," she replied. "It's being treated." "But it keeps getting worse," Ethan insisted. Margaret's expression tightened. "It will go away." Ethan pushed his chair back slightly. "You're not telling me everything." Margaret looked hurt. "Why would I lie to you?" "Because something doesn't make sense," Ethan said. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet kitchen suddenly felt smaller, heavier. Margaret lowered her eyes. "It's embarrassing, Ethan," she admitted softly. "I didn't want to talk about it." But instead of calming him, her words deepened Ethan's unease. Embarrassment meant secrecy. And secrecy, in Ethan's mind, meant something serious was being hidden. That night the house felt colder than usual. Margaret moved quietly through the rooms, avoiding confrontation. Ethan sat alone in the living room, staring at the television without really watching it. The smell lingered in the air again. And with it came the feeling that something inside the house was slowly breaking apart. By the third week, the tension inside the Cole house had grown so heavy that even the smallest conversation felt dangerous. Ethan barely slept at night. The smell had become more than an irritation, it had turned into a constant presence in his mind. Sometimes he imagined he could detect it even when Margaret wasn't in the room. It followed him through the hallway, into the kitchen, and even lingered in his thoughts while he lay awake in bed. Margaret noticed the change in him. "You look exhausted," she said one morning as Ethan poured coffee at the counter. "I'm fine," he replied without looking at her. But he wasn't fine. Every unanswered question fed the storm building inside his head. The breaking point came on a cold Thursday evening. Margaret stood at the stove preparing dinner, the familiar smell of frying onions filling the kitchen. Ethan entered the room quietly and leaned against the counter. At first, everything seemed normal. Then Margaret stepped closer to place a plate on the table. The odor hit him again. Stronger than it had ever been. Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's it," he muttered. Margaret turned. "What?" "I can't take this anymore." Her eyebrows lifted in confusion. "Ethan, what are you talking about?" "That smell," he snapped. Margaret sighed, clearly frustrated. "We've talked about this already." "No," Ethan said, his voice rising. "You've avoided it. I told you it's an infection." "Then show me." Margaret froze. "Excuse me? If it's just a rash or infection, why won't you show me?" Her face flushed with embarrassment. "Because it's personal," she said quietly. "That's not an answer." "It should be." Ethan paced across the kitchen, his agitation growing. "You keep hiding things," he said. "You won't explain anything." Margaret's voice trembled. "I'm not hiding anything. I'm just asking for a little dignity." Ethan stopped walking. "That smell doesn't come from a simple rash." Margaret looked stunned. "What are you implying?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted, his voice shaking with anger and fear. "But something about this isn't right." Margaret's eyes filled with exhaustion. "Ethan, please," she whispered. "You're letting your imagination run wild." But Ethan was no longer thinking clearly. Days of suspicion, sleepless nights, and unanswered questions had built into something volatile. The kitchen felt smaller with every passing second. And both of them could feel it, the moment when their fragile peace was about to shatter. For a moment after Margaret's words, the kitchen fell completely silent. The frying pan still hissed softly on the stove, and the faint clatter of the wind chime outside drifted through the window. But inside the room, the air between mother and son had grown tense and fragile. Margaret slowly turned off the stove. "Ethan," she said gently, trying to steady the moment, "this conversation has gone too far." But Ethan stood rigid near the counter, his breathing uneven. "It hasn't gone far enough," he replied. Margaret stepped toward the hallway. "I'm tired," she said quietly. "We'll talk about this later." As she passed him, the odor surfaced again, sharp, sour, impossible to ignore. For Ethan, it felt like the final confirmation of everything he feared. "Don't walk away from me," he said. Margaret stopped but didn't turn around. "I'm not walking away," she answered softly. "I'm just trying to calm things down." Ethan stepped closer. "Then explain it." "I already did." "That's not the truth." Margaret finally faced him again. Her expression was no longer defensive, only weary. "I'm your mother, Ethan," she said. "I don't owe you proof of every private thing about my body." But by then, Ethan's mind had locked onto a single idea, that something was being hidden from him. And that idea had grown stronger than reason. "You're lying," he said. Margaret shook her head slowly. "No." Ethan reached out and grabbed her arm. "Tell me what's really going on." Margaret gasped. "You're hurting me." She tried to pull away, but Ethan tightened his grip. "Just tell me the truth." "I did tell you." Her voice broke with frustration and fear. In the struggle that followed, the two of them stumbled backward toward the kitchen table. A chair scraped loudly across the floor. Margaret tried to free herself, pushing against Ethan's chest. "Ethan, stop." But the argument had already crossed a line neither of them could undo. Within seconds, the chaos inside the kitchen turned into something far more dangerous. When everything finally stopped moving, the room became eerily still. Margaret Cole lay motionless on the floor. Ethan stood frozen in the center of the kitchen, staring down at what had just happened. The smell that had haunted him for days still lingered in the air. But now, for the first time, Ethan seemed to realize that the thing he feared most was no longer the smell. It was the silence that followed it. The house on Maplewood Drive remained quiet through the night. No lights turned on. No doors opened. The wind chime on the porch moved gently in the cold Ohio air, its soft metallic sound drifting across the empty street. Inside the house, Ethan Cole had not moved much from where he sat in the living room. Hours earlier, the chaos in the kitchen had ended in a silence he did not know how to escape. At first he had stood there, staring down at the floor as if time had suddenly stopped. Eventually he walked slowly into the living room and lowered himself into the same chair where he usually watched the evening news. But the television stayed dark. The clock on the wall ticked steadily through the night. Morning arrived quietly, just as it always did on Maplewood Drive. Around 9 o'clock, Mrs. Helen Carter, a neighbor who lived across the street, stepped outside to collect her newspaper. She had known Margaret Cole for more than 20 years. Margaret was the kind of person who always closed her curtains neatly at night and opened the front door each morning to water her rose bushes. That morning, something felt wrong. Margaret's curtains were still closed. And the front door of the Cole house stood slightly open. Helen frowned, walking a few steps closer across the sidewalk. "Margaret," she called from the walkway. No answer came. The open door unsettled her. Margaret was careful about things like that. After a moment of hesitation, Helen pulled out her phone and called the local police department. Within minutes, 2 patrol officers arrived at the quiet street. They approached the front door cautiously. "Hello? Anyone inside?" one officer called. The house was silent. They stepped inside and moved carefully through the living room. That was when they saw Ethan. He was sitting in a chair near the window, staring straight ahead. One of the officers spoke gently. "Sir, are you all right?" Ethan didn't look up right away. When he finally did, his expression was distant, almost empty. "She's in the kitchen," he said quietly. The officers exchanged a quick glance before moving down the hallway. Moments later, they found Margaret Cole lying on the kitchen floor. The room was still. The argument from the night before had long since faded, leaving only the aftermath behind. When the officers returned to the living room, Ethan had not moved. One of them asked softly, "Ethan, what happened here?" For several seconds, Ethan said nothing. Then he spoke in a voice that sounded hollow. "I told her to tell me the truth." The officer paused. "What truth?" Ethan's eyes drifted toward the hallway leading to the kitchen. "That smell," he whispered. And inside the quiet house on Maplewood Drive, the investigation into a tragedy had just begun. Within hours of the discovery, the quiet street on Maplewood Drive filled with police vehicles and yellow crime scene tape. The neighborhood that had always felt calm and predictable now stood frozen in uneasy silence. Curious neighbors watched from their windows as investigators moved carefully in and out of the Cole house. Inside, detectives began reconstructing what had happened during the previous night. The lead investigator, Detective Laura Bennett, had spent nearly 15 years working homicide cases across Franklin County. She had seen violence born from jealousy, addiction, financial desperation, and long-buried family conflict. But as she walked through the modest home of Margaret and Ethan Cole, something about the scene felt unusually tragic. There were no signs of forced entry. No evidence of an outsider. Everything pointed to a confrontation between 2 people who had lived under the same roof for decades. Detective Bennett first spoke with the patrol officers who had arrived that morning. "He didn't run," one officer explained. "He was just sitting there when we came in." "Did he say anything?" Bennett asked. "He kept mentioning a smell." Bennett frowned slightly. "A smell?" "That's what he said." Later that afternoon, Ethan Cole sat inside a small interview room at the police station. He looked exhausted, his hands resting motionless on the metal table in front of him. Detective Bennett sat across from him. "Ethan," she said calmly, "we need you to walk us through what happened last night." For several seconds, he stared down at the table. Then he spoke quietly. She wouldn't tell me the truth. What truth? Bennett asked. That smell, Ethan said again. Something was wrong with her. Bennett studied his expression carefully. Did your mother ever threaten you? No. Did she ever hurt you? Ethan shook his head. No. Then why did the argument turn violent? Ethan struggled to answer. His thoughts seemed tangled, as though he were still trying to make sense of the moment himself. She kept hiding it, he said finally. Meanwhile, investigators reviewed Margaret Cole's recent medical records. What they discovered began to clarify a painful reality. Margaret had recently visited her doctor for treatment of a severe skin infection. According to medical notes, the condition could produce a strong odor if the affected area became irritated or untreated. Detective Bennett read through the report slowly. It was not a secret disease. It was not something dangerous or mysterious. It was simply a medical condition Margaret had likely felt embarrassed discussing. Back in the interview room, Ethan sat quietly while detectives pieced together the timeline. What emerged was not a story of hatred or revenge. It was the story of a misunderstanding that had spiraled into obsession. And in the end, that obsession had turned an ordinary family argument into an irreversible tragedy. In the weeks that followed the tragedy on Maplewood Drive, the quiet Ohio neighborhood struggled to understand what had happened inside the Cole house. News of Margaret Cole's death spread quickly through the community. For many neighbors, the story was almost impossible to accept. Margaret had lived there for more than 30 years. She was known as the woman who tended her roses every morning and waved politely to people walking their dogs in the evening. Now her home stood behind police tape, silent and empty. At the county courthouse, Ethan Cole faced the consequences of a moment that could never be reversed. During the early hearings, he appeared subdued and withdrawn. Those who saw him in the courtroom described a man who looked less angry than lost. Detective Laura Bennett attended several of the proceedings, quietly observing from the back of the room. As the details of the investigation were presented, the story that unfolded felt both tragic and painfully simple. Margaret had not been hiding a dangerous secret. Medical testimony confirmed what investigators had already discovered. The odor Ethan had become obsessed with came from a severe skin infection that had recently developed. It was treatable, and according to her doctor, Margaret had already begun medication. But embarrassment had kept her from explaining the condition in detail to her son. That small silence had grown into suspicion. Suspicion had turned into fear. And fear, left alone inside a house where two people had lived in emotional isolation for years, eventually exploded into violence. During one of the hearings, Ethan finally spoke briefly when the judge asked if he understood the charges against him. His voice was barely audible. Yes, Your Honor. For a moment he lowered his head, staring at the table in front of him. Those in the courtroom watched quietly as he whispered something almost no one could hear. I should have believed her. The statement hung in the room longer than anyone expected. Margaret Cole had spent most of her life protecting and caring for her son. The house they shared had once been filled with ordinary routines, home-cooked dinners, quiet evenings, and the familiar comfort of a long-standing bond between mother and child. Now that house stood empty. In the end, the tragedy on Maplewood Drive left behind a painful reminder of how fragile trust can become when fear and misunderstanding take its place. Sometimes the smallest doubts, left unanswered, can slowly grow until they destroy everything that once held a family together.